My project is on races of corn, or razas de maíz, and this is something that's very commonplace in Mexico, but I had never heard about. I began this project looking comparatively at race in the US and Mexico, and recognizing that there are some real fundamental differences in how race is recognized or constituted. And I began in Mexico at a human genome research project. They were trying to establish the Mexican genome. And I thought, well, that's intriguing, and it sounds very racial compared to my understanding of how geneticists think about race in the US. Well, I got down there, started doing some field work, and I realized it was far more complicated than I realized at first. They weren't thinking in a necessarily biological sense about race, and they were seeing it as something historically constituted, which geneticists in the US tend not to do. While I was down there, I was directed by a colleague towards this other genomics project on maize, corn. And this is at Lange Bio. It's a national laboratory on biodiversity in the state of Guanajuato. And they are interested in establishing the razas de maíz, the races of corn. And there might be, estimates range from 34 to 59. And there's various criteria. And I had never heard race applied to non-humans. Well, what I did with this HRA is both a kind of ethnographic study in Mexico to see how these uses are developed, and then a historical study in Spain. And I asked a very basic question: how does race come to be applied to corn? And I went to Spain to work in the archives there at a number of botanical gardens, and I looked at the botanical surveys conducted in the late 1700s, early 1800s in Mexico and throughout the New World, and I was looking to find the uses of raza as a kind of technical term, and it wasn't there, much to my chagrin and surprise. But what I found instead is that there's a broader history, and that's to the term raza, or which we translate as race. And what I learned was that it began on non-humans. It was first used in Italian and French in the 1400s on dogs, and it was a term that aristocrats used to talk about the nobility of their hunting dogs. So they would talk about razas de perros, like we would talk about breeds of dogs. And they very purposely thought in genealogical terms. And it was their way, while they were trying to think about genealogy in people, they set up a set of parallels about genealogies of dogs, which they articulated with the concept of raza. Well, then raza moves to horses, and then to cows, cattle, sheep, etc., all these domesticated species. And it's that tradition that is used, or that manifests when they talk about razas de maíz. This, as a plant, wasn't of interest to the early Spanish explorers. The Spanish initially thought that corn was millet. They were using Aristotelian categories. Well, this must be the same plant we have in Europe. It must be millet. So they didn't study it scientifically because it was a domesticated species. The key thing about all of these uses of raza is that they are on domesticated species. And when we talk about race in the US, we think about it very critically. We assume that it's a naturalized notion, and that humans are not natural in that sense. We're social creatures. Well, it turns out that raza, in this sense, and and this is where the English term comes from, it's really not about natural species at all. It's about domesticated species and how they are consciously bred. So this gives me a view of racial thinking that's far more complicated than my previous understanding from looking at race in the US.